When I was growing up in upstate New York, there was a teacher who directed some of our high school productions. And there was this one particular play that when we were in rehearsals, they had some of the leads over to their place to watch movies on Saturday afternoons. It was innocent enough, and it seemed to build camaraderie among the students who were invited. But looking back on it, I question its appropriateness. I sensed that this particular teacher was perhaps lonely in our small one-like town, that they were younger than most of their colleagues who were also coupled. It was understandable that they wanted connection, but I wonder if there was a better way to seek that than socializing with students. Fast forward a couple of years to my undergrad. I was in an opera workshop class when my professor announced to the class that the reason I was having trouble connecting to a love scene was because I was singing to a woman and that I was gay. I hadn't come out yet, so that was not ideal. I addressed the issue with the professor after class, but should have reported it to the administration. Fast forward several more years. Now I am working as an early career voice teacher. The head of the musical theater program at my institution is known for verbally abusing students. I knew this, everyone knew this, and sometimes I saw it firsthand, and yet I didn't know what to do about it. I was an adjunct teacher, and I didn't feel that I had the agency to speak up without sacrificing my job security. And to this day, I can tell you, I deeply regret not addressing that issue, knowing it was putting students in harm's way. Hi, my name is David Sisko. My pronouns are he, him, and you are very welcome to my podcast, Wholehearted Voice Pedagogy, which I promise is going to lighten up in a moment. This podcast is dedicated to the art and practice of teaching singers. It is an extension of my book of the same title, which was published by Routledge Press and released this past July. It's available on Amazon, Routledge.com, or anywhere you get your books. Today, as you probably have guessed, we're going to dive into some thorny subjects, particularly talking about a teacher's code of ethics. My special guest is my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Nicholas Perna, who is an associate professor of voice and director of vocal pedagogy at the University of Colorado Boulder. More on him in just a moment. But first, let's review some key tenets of ethical teaching by looking at the code of ethics of three different voice organizations: the National Association of Teachers of Singing, the American Academy of Teachers of Singing, and the Pan-American Vocology Association. NATS breaks down the code of ethics into three parts: personal ethical standards relating to students, and ethical standards relating to colleagues. Under personal standards, NATS challenges members to present themselves honestly, to possess competence in all aspects of voice pedagogy, musicianship, and repertoire, and strive for continued growth as a teaching artist. They admonish members to respect the privacy and personal integrity of students, to maintain appropriate boundaries and act in a professional manner, and refrain from making exaggerated claims about what they can do for their students. Finally, under ethical standards relating to colleagues, members are to refrain from making defamatory or untrue negative public comments or judgments about a colleague or their students, either verbally or in writing, work collegially with other professionals when the need arises, and adjudicate auditions and competitions in an honest, unbiased way. The American Academy of Teachers of Singing covers some of the same ground as the NATS Code of Ethics, but goes into further detail. They start by reflecting on the ethical considerations regarding the proper preparation of teachers of singing, noting that, quote, "It is unethical to promote one particular pedagogical system or methodology to the exclusion of all others, nor should the pedagogy draw exclusively from either historical or current sources," unquote. Regarding the student-teacher relationship, they note that, quote, it is unethical for teachers to criticize work done with students' former teachers, to insist that their method is the only way to make good progress in vocal skills, or to promise financial success or other extravagant hopes, unquote. They also note that, quote, students have the right to expect from their teachers a consistent interest in their mental and physical well-being, unquote, without them behaving as a friend, parent, or mental health professional. The Academy also shares ethical guidelines regarding adjudication, competitions, professional management, and dealing with coaches, critics, stage directors, and apprenticeship programs. Finally, key aspects of the PAVA Code of Ethics include maintaining professional standards and competency in the field, prioritizing the welfare, rights, and safety of their clients, avoiding conflicts of interest regarding professional responsibilities, and providing truthful information regarding services and qualifications. So, with all this information kind of roaming around in our brains, it's now time for me to introduce to you our very special guest, Dr. Nicholas Perna. Nick is Associate Professor and Director of Vocal Pedagogy at the University of Colorado Boulder, where he directs the Berton Coffin Voice Lab. A Van Lawrence Fellow and PAVA recognized vocalist, his research focuses on acoustics, nasality, and cross-training. He is the creator and host of the Vocal Fry podcast, which I'm sure you're aware of, and is the NATS VP of Outreach and will become the NATS president-elect in July. Perna's singing has been praised as an impressive sound by the Houston Chronicle and for his emotionally driven performance, South Florida Sun Sentinel. His students perform on Broadway, national and international tours, and have won prestigious competitions. Nick, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, David, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation to have me on.
Oh my gosh, the easiest decision ever. I was trying to remember, we met in Australia.
That's the first time we met in person. Yes.
Yes, we had corresponded,
Yes, because we have an
but
old mutual friend, both of us.
yes.
But not who has nothing to do with singing.
Right.
Uh, but yeah, I think the first time we had met was in Brisbane. It took us going across 5 continents to actually meet in person,
Yes. Yeah, and it was great. Ever since then I was like, yes, I want more of this person.
which is a long time ago now, by the way.
That was like 2017, 18.
Uh, 13.
Yeah. How? It's crazy. Yeah, no, it's those every 4 year type of conferences seem to go by very
And
quickly.
they really date your a life experience.
Indeed.
Uh-huh.
Indeed.
We were just talking about my kids. I mean, my kids were babies when I went to that conference,
Right,
and
right.
they are not.
They're not now, yes. So we're going to dive into a juicy topic today, which I'm very excited about. We're going to talk about a teacher's code of ethics. And you were very generous to share a draft of one of your chapters from your forthcoming book, which I'm very excited about. And I'm going to grill you a little bit more later on when that's coming out. But for now, I just wanted to ask you, you talk about some general standards voice teachers should uphold. But can you share maybe the concept of the responsibility chair, which I understood kind of came out of your podcast? Is that correct?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you what it came out of. It came out of the fact that I had already. It's a lecture that I've been giving to my classes, my voice pedagogy classes now for over a decade. I'm going to say almost 15 years. Because I realized that, I mean, when we sort of came up through school and whatever and whatever, and I started teaching pedagogy, it dawned upon me that like none of the pedagogy books that I was using talked about the ethics of doing all of this.
Yeah.
And of course remembering things like books where it talked about hovering over your student and pushing down on their abdomen and blah 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 blah. And I was like, "Oh my God." And it dawned upon me that I needed a way to educate the next generation of teachers, as I now have been for, I've been teaching pedagogy for almost 20 years, that I needed to incorporate this into my class teaching. And if I may just preface this whole conversation with something I thought about that I think is very poignant to to your audience, which is, don't think that just because you and I are here talking about ethics and trying to encourage everyone to behave ethically, that we've always been perfect, that
No.
we have always been perfectly ethical beings with perfect morals, and that doesn't exist. And so, like, if you're listening to this and you are a teacher or a singer or whatever, also give yourself a little bit of a break and realize that your own journey, we are all constantly growing and evolving and learning and whatever. And so part of this is also like the concept of the responsibility chair, coming back to your question, is that I realized that I think it is the part of the teacher, as you develop and grow as a teacher, to realize that your words matter, your actions matter, and it is the responsibility, due to the inherent power dynamics, which we can work to get rid of as hard as we want. And we should,
Of course.
but they are still there in that music lesson, centuries of master apprentice model history behind it. And so when we are, the responsibility chair literally being like the piano bench. I mean, as I sit here at my piano in my home, which I've blocked out, um, uh, it is your responsibility when you take on this, perspective of teaching. It is up to you to create the situations, the boundaries, the expectations of ethical behavior in the role of the teacher. I mean, because we cannot expect, we should not expect our students to have to be the guide of ethical practice in our lessons. And it's funny, you were talking about the chapter. I'll say one thing about it really quickly, which is that I think that you should either, when you draft things as a writer, you should either draft them drunk, high, or really mad. And I rage wrote that chapter after a recent social media post of a very famous singer who I will not name, encroaching upon another singer's personal space in a masterclass setting that I found to be wildly inappropriate.
Yeah.
And this chapter was already forthcoming, and I give this lecture I give it twice a year. I give it once to my grads and once to my undergrads. And so it's not something that I was unfamiliar with what I wanted to put in the chapter anyway, but then I like rage wrote it in like 10 hours in terms of the first draft of it. Because I was just so upset that these things are still happening, and that our singers and our students are still put in these situations that we should not expect them to have to be the one who's putting up boundaries and saying, no, I'm not comfortable with you touching me that way, or
Right.
I'm not comfortable. Like, we have the responsibility as the educator to put these, you know, things in practice. So that's where it came from.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, and so necessary. And I just want to underscore something that you shared, which is ethics is a practice. Just like
Yeah.
singing, just like teaching, it is not something that we perfect. It is something that we have to enter into situation by situation. And there are times that we are going to fail, and there are times that we are going to, meet expectations or maybe even exceed. And that means nothing when it comes to that next decision that we've made. that we need to
And
make.
and we learn.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
learn, you know? Yes. Totally
Yeah.
agreed.
So in the chapter, you talk about kind of going beyond the standard oath that speech and language pathologists and medical professionals take, which is do no harm. What are some ways teachers can extend ourselves beyond that baseline?
So I think so much of this has to do with I'll tie it in with something Kari Reagan writes in her book about, just sort of the evidence-based voice pedagogy model, which is like the idea of the student expectations, kind of like turning towards student, autonomy and turning towards, student desire. I think that if we as teachers are keeping that at the forefront of our mind, it is the first checkpoint, let's say, in checking our own egos and realizing what does this person who has come to me as a singing student, whatever that environment is, independent studio, academia, what doesn't matter. What is this person desiring from this experience? What can I give them? And and if we're starting from that place, then I think we can immediately think about how do we go past, how do we give the student what they desire rather than it being just about I'm not going to harm this person, which is of course that's a as one of my doctoral students would say, that's a really low bar. Like in a way, it's a really low bar in
Yeah.
actuality. And rather, how do we lift this person to where they wish to be? And if that's really where we start, then I think, we're already starting in a place that is past, let's just not do any harm, which of course, that's a great thing. We should not do any harm psychologically, emotionally, physically, musically, although probably a little harder to define exactly what doing musical harm would be.
Oh, I've
But
seen it done.
sure, 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 sure. But probably a little easier to define physical harm
Yes,
or emotional harm than it is to define
of
musical
course.
harm. You didn't go toward that 5/7 chord. You have to go anyway.
Right.
Excuse me. I Forgive me, I'm coming off of having had a respiratory thing last week. Anyway, so I mean that's really what it's about. I think that's the first and most practical way, is just as a way of checking ourselves, is are we seeking out what our students want, what they desire, rather than what we maybe immediately desire? Because I remember a colleague coming into my office. This is over a decade ago. Colleague coming into my office with this young student who, aspiring singer, and they came into my office and they're like, "Man, they could be singing at the Met in 10 years." And I remember looking at them and saying, "Do they want to?" Because like immediately, like that voice teacher, I remember being a aspiring young teacher and thinking, oh my gosh, this person could be on Broadway, like this person could be whatever. But is that what they wished for out of their life?
Yeah.
Because one of the advantages of being a little bit older is you kind of realize that, like, well, there's certain sacrifices you make in life if you're actually looking to have that kind of life that maybe that person doesn't want to make for themselves. And so you have to be constantly thinking of, like, how do I lift this person up past where I am, if that's what they want, you know? But what if it's not what they want? What if what they want is to sing and enjoy a glass of wine for an hour and sing karaoke for an hour and leave feeling better than they felt when they walked in?
Right.
So I think it has to go way past just do no harm. I think it has to be about giving the student what it is that they're after.
I mean, you've already kind of answered the next question, which is how is being ethical actually student centered? That's a great example of that.
Well, and I think that, when we are thinking of students first, so much of it is having that initial conversation, right? Like, and having an ongoing dialogue of what are your goals? What are your, what are your short-term goals? What are your long, maybe midterm goals? What are your, I always kind of talk with my students about like a 3 month thing, a year thing, and like a 5 or 10 year thing, and obviously the really long thing is always evolving for all of us. It's changing. It's, whatever. But a 3 month thing, if we're thinking of a 3 month goal, then we can really be like, okay, what could we do today to help you get toward that?
Mhm.
And and I think it applies to so much, right? Like with students, it applies to like what repertoire they want to do. It applies to what their career aspirations are. It applies to their own, even as I was kind of alluding to earlier, their own experience in that lesson, right? Because not everyone, hear me, voice teachers, I love you all. Not everybody comes just desiring to just sing better. Like there might be more reasons than that they are taking a voice lesson. And if you haven't, like if they came in and you just started with your normal practice, whatever that is, your first exercise or second exercise or diagnostic exercise or whatever, it goes back to me. I remember being a young teacher and just diving into an exercise. And I always make a joke on the podcast about just it's a lip trill on a 5 note scale. Because what else would you do first? But which is fine, of course. That's a fine exercise. But um, I remember being a young teacher with a musical theater singer who also had to, in an academic setting, sing like classical. And I remember, again, 15, 20 years ago, me like wanting to kind of get started on their classical piece because I knew it would take them longer. And I remember like being several weeks into a semester before I had even actually even heard them sing a musical theater song. And I remember all of a sudden like the experience of like, okay, well, let's get this out and see how it is. And them just like ripping through something they already knew. And I'm going, oh, I've missed this. I have missed the boat with this person completely.
Yeah,
Because I didn't take the time to actually see really who they were, what they were, why they were. Like, are we actually exploring with our singers their own why, their own, because if we're not, then we're not setting up a safe space to begin with. We're setting up
sure.
our safe space rather than their safe space.
Right. And recognizing that what they want is, you know, can change on a
Oh my
lesson
gosh.
to lesson basis, right? Because they are, especially, when we're working, secondary, post-secondary, independently, we're working with younger singers. I mean, that's going to change all the time.
I mean, it changes with adults too.
Sure.
And I mean, and my God, if you teach children, their desires are changing every 5 minutes sometimes. So, I mean, this is true of any age level. And obviously, if you're teaching 8-year-olds, it's a little bit different because they're not, they're kids, and so they're, whatever. But, if you are teaching adults, if I may, one of my most successful doctoral students ever, she has a giant studio, private practice, who teaches nothing but avocational pop singers. That is her entire studio population. She's booked to the gills. She's got a wait list, whatever. She tried academia, did not like it, whatever. But she had to, within her own practice, realize that it was those clients that she really spoke to. And so, like, having these conversations with students also helped her realize what, like, her own purpose was as a teacher.
Hmm.
And that in and of itself also helps create a safe space because if I may, you're not going to be everything to everybody. We all end up with these kind of specialities of client It's one of the reasons I actually talk about that on my own website, like on my own private booking website. It's like these are kind of the populations I tend to teach. I teach others, but this is kind of what I focus on. And I think that even in itself helps you be student centric because you're aware of just kind of your own gifts and your own, you know, leanings and what have you with students.
Yeah. And knowing when to speak on that and saying, I love that you want to do this. I celebrate that. I see that desire and that drive and that fire for you to do this, and I'm probably not the right person. So let me refer you to somebody who does this. You know.
That is a big point that I get to in the chapter,
Yeah.
is that the hardest thing that you have to sometimes early on learn how to say as a teacher is, I don't know. And then I propose two options of, I don't know, but I'll find out. Okay. Or I don't know, but I know someone who does. And, you know, I think too often we have a little bit of scarcity mindset within our own community, thinking of,
Like,
but I need that student for my income. Or if you're in academia, if that student leaves my studio, I might not get tenure, or I might, this, that, or the other. But that has not been my experience. My experience has been that sometimes allowing a student the option to move toward another path is so much better for you, so much better for them, so much better for everyone involved that it usually works out because, I'm not a, I have a client who studies with me basically to just, to quote our pop music community, he studies with me to try to find his mix. It's his whole fine. And I can help him do that. But I recently, he was talking about distortions and wanting to work in more growls and stylistic things. And I referred him out because it's something I've figured out how to do, but it's not something I teach. And I think we have got to be, I think it's one of the reasons, and I talk about this a little bit in the chapter, that our own network helps to keep us ethical because then we know who to refer people to, who to progress people on to,
yeah.
and it's not just referring people out to a speech language pathologist or a medical doctor when that needs to be, although that is part of it as well. We should not be diagnosing medical issues in the voice studio.
No.
We shouldn't be diagnosing psychiatric issues either.
Right.
But that is part of ethical practice as well. But also, I think with the voice teacher thing, we've got to be willing to be like, hey, you know what? We've worked together for a few years. I think it's maybe time for you to progress on. You need to get to New York. You need to, they're trying to do the aspiring thing. Here's a list of people, you might want to consider working with, whatever. We can have check-ins maybe from time to time. I have a lot of clients like this. I mean, that just
Yeah.
come back for check-ins and, what have you. I mean, but I think that one of the sentences that I write that's my favorite in the chapter is, a voice teacher is for a season, probably not forever. And gosh, I think too often early on in our teaching careers, we think maybe that we need to be everyone's solution forever. And that's not practical, right?
It's not sustainable, right?
It's not sustainable, no.
Right. And it's also, yeah, it then it's about us and it's not about them, right?
Exactly.
I mean,
Exactly.
similar to what you're saying. I mean, the conversation I always have with my voice students or coaching students, I say, I'm on your team for the rest of my living days. If you want it, if you need something, you
100%.
reach out. I'm here. Go work with other people. Love that for you. That's what I did. That's what everyone does. You need other points of view. Great. I'm here if you need something,
100%.
but
I
I'm
mean,
not keeping you here.
and I'm very fortunate that both in my private practice and in my university practice, I have several students that I co-teach with other voice teachers. And and I have found that to be so rewarding because I also then learn. You know, they'll introduce an exercise to them or something that maybe I don't use, and I'll be like, "Oh, I see like why that is efficacious or why we're doing that. I should incorporate that myself." You know, like because we also in these like ideas of referring out, then we are learning too, right? Like we're,
Right.
you know, which again points back to if we're learning as well, then it also it helps take the ego out of the situation itself because then we're admitting that we don't know all the answers. We are all still on this journey because I'm sorry, the singing voice, as soon as you think you've got the singing voice figured out, you've got something else to learn. I
Yes.
mean, as someone who both dabbles in science and who has written about this stuff and who, you know, has the great fortune of running a voice pedagogy program at a university, God, I learn stuff all the time.
Yeah.
And I hope to continue to do that until I stop doing this.
Right. Yeah. The moment I think I know what I need to know, I will retire. I know that's the time. Hang it up. because
Seriously.
because
Seriously.
then we don't have curiosity anymore.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And it's so important that we also then model that for our students too,
Sure.
which helps them avoid like the attitude of, oh, well, if you want to actually sing well, you need to study with my teacher. Well, why would we even ever say that?
Right. Gross. So you also talk about in the chapter teacher and technique shaming. And I want to quote this particular sentence from the chapter because I found it to be very potent. You write,
Okay.
one of the most important reasons for not predetermining judgment of a colleague's teaching based on their students' singing is that we, as external observers, never know the responsiveness or life situation of the student we heard sing. Amen. And please say more.
This is actually one of the big landing points of the lecture when I give this lecture is because I think that there is a history in our community of you know, oh, well, their students all do this, or their students all do that, or they all breathe this way, or whatever. You know, these sort of gossipy, you know, garbage things that are part of this industry.
I have no clue what you're talking about.
Okay, sure. Right. And, you know, I, whenever I see someone sing, let's say I'm at Nats adjudicating, whether it's a chapter event, a regional event, or NSA or what have you. I just did the finals for the International Regions Conference. Um, I would never make an assumption about someone's teaching if their student had just broken up with a boyfriend or something like that before they went out and sang, or if they were literally starving to have a meal and and they did not know where their next meal was going to come from and so they were emotionally distraught or insert one of a billion scenarios that maybe they were ill and it wasn't showing in their voice, but they were sick. We never know in most of these external situations, and I'm thinking of things like a jury or adjudicating any competition. You know, the Met was this weekend, L'Enfant semifinals. We don't know what those people's life experiences was in that moment. We don't know. Maybe they had realized that they all of a sudden got a $5,000 tax bill. It's tax season. Maybe they realized that they owe the IRS a whole crap ton of money and they are in panic mode. Well, maybe they didn't then sing their best. Why in the world should I then blame their teacher for them not singing their best when that person is struggling through something in their own personal life that I know nothing about? You know, I have learned over the years to give voice teachers a lot more grace and realize and to, quite frankly, if I may, to give singers a lot more grace.
Yeah.
We all do this thing, which is very courageous, just showing up and going out and showing ourselves to the world with our voice in public, you know, and we there is so much that is unknown to us as the observer that to then, out of any experience, whatever that was, to then put some kind of judgment on someone's facility as a teacher, when you actually stop and think about it, it actually kind of seems ridiculous that we would ever even do that. I know it's it's a cultural thing that has happened, but
Yeah.
and partially, well, anyway, long story short, I just, we never know what has been happening behind closed doors and what is going on in someone's personal life. And so we should not be so quick to judge their singing or their teacher's teaching based on a hearing of them and whatever. And, I talk about sometimes I am asked, in fact, part of my job, I have to evaluate teaching all the time, my teaching assistants, my graduate students, whatever, and also as a mentor in the National Mentoring Collaborative. Um, I generally do not talk about anybody else's teaching. If a teacher has asked me for an evaluation and they've sent me a video just as a mentoring thing, I of course share thoughts and can make observations based on what they sent me. But I remember a situation recently where I they fortunately said at the beginning of a lesson that the student had been ill. And so I already at least knew that
Mm.
and had some prior information then about the context of even what was going on in the lesson that I could then help that evaluation, that mentorship, and help basically be more encouraging to them of like, hey, this person was under the weather. These were some good benchmarks that you put in place, kind of got guardrails for that session, that I wouldn't have known otherwise. And you know, there's a later chapter that's still being drafted that actually is the afterword for the book, which is about mentoring voice teachers.
Mm.
And that comes with its own set of ethics when you are trying to, raise up a colleague and, be a colleague and you're not their teacher anymore. You are a colleague. It really kind of takes on a different form of dynamic where you're having to reevaluate even how you're approaching their teaching or their students singing or what have you, which I think is an important critical thing because I think one of the things that we don't want to be as teachers or as mentors is we don't want to end up gatekeeping. And what we want to do is raise up the next generation or even a generation that's ahead of us or whoever that has sought us out for mentoring to be, hopefully, going above and beyond us. Again, just going beyond do no harm. Let's do better than that.
We've kind of covered the topic of ethics in a somewhat philosophical way, and I'm wondering if we can maybe go kind of drill down a little bit further. And I'm wondering, do you have an experience as a student or as a teacher that you would feel comfortable sharing that kind of highlights the kind of ethical dilemma a voice teacher might face, and how was that resolved?
So I want to preface this by saying that I've been very open about my own journey as a singer, a singing teacher. There were many years where I struggled with my own singing. My first academic job, I was actually illegally forced into resignation at the threat of an immediate termination and was denied the right to even go up for tenure. So like I I I am very keenly aware of these sorts of practices. In my own life, when I was younger, I went through many years of struggling with my own body size that was negatively affecting my health. This is not to be encouraging anyone that they need to be slender, but in my own life experience, it was negatively affecting my health. And while I was larger and I was an aspiring singer at that point, I remember a artistic administrator at a opera company looking right at me. I had actually just introduced this person to my wife. We were newly married. And they looked right at me and said, "Oh, put on a lot of weight this year. Time for some laps in the pool." And I, at the time, I was struggling with enough things that I didn't, you know, that sort of thing was very unhelpful to me
Sure.
as a singer. And, I've had worse things happen. I have actually had a colleague voice teacher who I was sent to, basically forced to have voice lessons with, who shoved their hand into my lower abdominal area in order to teach me how to breathe. So like it can be easy maybe for us to think that, well, here I am, a middle-aged cis white man, that I've had this privileged existence, and I have in certain ways, but also I have also been on the back end of unethical behavior,
Sure.
which is one of the reasons that I think am so adamant about incorporating this into both my classes and my book, because I mean, we've got to change, because there are way too many centuries at this point of this kind of behavior in our field. And I mean, it was part of the inspiration for your book, right? Just wanting to for your book
Yeah.
is wanting us to be better, right? I
Yeah.
mean, because these kind of behaviors have just gone on for far too long. We have allowed for them, and if I may, I mean, in my own position now as the director of voice pedagogy at CU Boulder, I just refuse to not be my students need to know that when they go out and teach, they should not be acting this way.
Yeah.
And it is, and I will say, I think the generations that are coming behind us are much more keenly, maybe they're more emotionally intelligent, is a
Mhm.
way to put it, and they're already like aware. One of the things I didn't write in the chapter, but that I think is just a general tenet that I kind of hold to, is that broken people tend to break people, and healing people tend to heal people. And I am a person who was broken and work on my own healing all the time through my own therapy, through my own life development, through my own journey, and what have you. And I hope to be a person who heals people along the way and lifts them up, rather than someone who perpetuates cycles of brokenness in our field, which honestly I think that was a lot of the history of applied music lessons, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
one of the reasons, if I may, just one other thing about that. It's one of the other reasons I'm so big on the fact that I do not touch students. I just don't. It is not part of my practice. I talk about this a little bit in the chapter, pointing to Maria Maxfield's article in Journal of Singing a couple years ago. Maria Maxfield, CU Boulder alum. Um, and I just, it is not part of my practice. It is just not part of my practice. And I know there are some semantic arguments about things that are part of the culture and the world that we live in, but my instruction to my TAs and my students is that they also There is no proven efficacy in a teacher physically touching a student. And so, therefore, and because you cannot remove the inherent power dynamic from that situation, as hard as you try, we do not need to be touching our students.
Agreed. And I interviewed Dr. Elizabeth Benson and Kate Rosen.
Great episode, by the way.
Oh,
Fantastic
thank you.
episode.
And they actually Elizabeth shared some really great ways to circumvent that. And they actually just had an article, I think, come out in Voice and
They
Speech
did.
as
It was
well.
just, yeah, yeah, yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of research sharing sharing what you're talking about, that there's not an efficacy in pedagogical touch, and it's actually harmful. And so yeah, and this is the thing too that's challenging, I think, with ethics too, right? Is that things are evolving, right? That we
Yes.
it's not just that, it's not just, as you said, that do no harm. It's that we have to be aware enough of how things are changing culturally within our institutions, within our own, with our students, like how those things are changing, so we can adjust, you know per student, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's what makes this so challenging, right?
Well, I actually have a student right now who very high level singer, very skilled singer, and they were conservatory trained. They were shocked by the notion that like I didn't touch students because it had just they had just never even like heard of such a thing, that like you wouldn't do that. And golly, it's just and then now again, kind of going back to where we started this episode, have I ever touched a student? Yes. And I want to be, forthcoming with the fact that, 15 years ago, not common part of my practice, but it's something I have done before. And so
Sure.
I don't want you as a voice teacher out there just being, loathing yourself with self-guilt of like, oh my God, I put my hand on a student's shoulder or whatever. I have done that in the past. It is no longer part of my current practice because I evolved. I learned. I learned more stuff and I changed my mind.
Yeah.
And so that is so much of a part of this. And I also had really crappy stuff happen to me. And I was like, you know what? That doesn't need to happen to anybody else on my watch. And so for the influence that I have with whoever I have that over in whatever way I do, I am going to encourage them not to do that thing.
Can you share some recommendations about how independent and post-secondary teachers can can report unethical behavior? When is that a good idea? How to go about it? I know institutionally there are oftentimes means in place, but I'm open to any thoughts that you have in terms of how to sound the alarm when in a way that is itself ethical.
Well, okay, let me take this from two different perspectives. The first perspective is I think that we all, if we are in certain states, we have to consider what our mandatory reporting laws are regarding if we observe someone who is physically abused, uh, you know, or if they report abuse to us or action to us. I would encourage voice teachers in general to familiarize themselves with their mandatory reporting laws. A lot of times, independent studios technically don't fall under that, depending on your municipality, your state, whatever. But like, I just think it's good practice at this point for you to familiarize yourself with what is mandatory reporting, when do you have to mandatory report, and that varies by state. That is usually a state statute, not a federal statute. So, and you very well may even have your own institutional statutes if you're in K to 12 education, if you're in, higher ed, whatever. So that's the first facet of that. I think the second part of that, which is a little bit more maybe nuanced, which is if you I think that all of us, I'm wearing my Nats shirt on purpose today. If you are a member of the National Association of Teachers of Singing, I and you have not read the Nats Code of Ethics, I strongly want to recommend that you do read the Nats Code of Ethics. Because that document is thorough, it is short, it was vetted by legal counsel, and is something that we as members of the National Association of Teachers of Singing are bound by as a governing document.
Yeah.
And I think that as an organization, there are specific ethics violations that there's a process that we have of how that reporting actually goes. And what I want to say about that is it is rare that those instances result in someone being removed from the organization. But what most of the time happens is what we want to put in place is a process by which we can all learn, we can all modify our behavior, and we can get better. Right? Rather than just disregarding someone, they made a mistake, maybe they did make a mistake, and if it's a legal mistake, then that needs to be handled by legal authorities. Or institutional authorities or whatever. I mean, look, if we make a mistake, there could be employment consequences, there could be legal consequences. That's just true of life, right? If I run a red light, I could get a violation. That's just, doesn't mean that, I can now learn. That's true. But also it doesn't mean there aren't consequences.
Yeah.
But I think that one of the things that peer-to-peer mentorship can do is that we can then, if there was something that happened, we hopefully can then learn from it and continue to move the profession forward. Because if our action is just, I'm now going to shun you for your behavior and you're out of the tribe and whatever, well, then now the tribe has not gotten any better. I mean, now sometimes there are bad actors okay, that's a different thing.
Sure.
Okay, fine.
Sure.
But I just really want to encourage everyone out there, if you've not read the Nats Code of Ethics, regardless of how you feel about the National Association of Teachers of Singing, if you've not read the Nats Code of Ethics, it's free and open on the website. I would encourage you to do so because I think it deals with how our ethics with peers, our ethics with students, and ethics to the organization. And that's a little bit different if you're not a Nats member. But I think that those other two sections, ethics toward the student and ethical behavior toward peer voice teachers, are very important parts of that policy for all of us that we could all learn from. And I think that then we have a better idea of just how to interact with one another. And so that we can be moving this tribe of voice teachers forward,
Right.
And evolving rather than repeating our mistakes.
Mm-hmm. If I may, I just want to add a couple of things that I wish I had known in my early career, which is now being a part of a bigger university. We do training every year that outlines exactly what the reporting qualifications are, or what you have to report, when you report it, and also that there is that you can't be retaliated against for reporting, which I wish I had known as an adjunct teacher in my early years, And I just also want us to continue to uplift the idea of curiosity when these types of things come up, because just as you said, we can't judge the teacher just based on what happens with the singer. There are things that we are not probably seeing,
Yep.
and it's very easy, and I speak for myself, it's very easy to come to a conclusion about someone based on what someone else has said. And certainly we take that seriously, but we hold that lightly, and with curiosity. So we maintain our own ethical practice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is always, as we said several times, always evolving.
Yeah.
You know, we're always learning and we're always, trying to uphold ourselves to a higher standard than we did maybe the day before. But at the same time, you also got to give yourself grace. You're going to screw up. I mean, it's a thing you're going to make a mistake. I mean, it's part of being a human.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, everything that we do is, as a teacher, is relational. So,
Yes.
it's so, of course, we're going to make mistakes, and how can we continue to learn to fail better, I like to say. And how do we have conversations, respectful, thoughtful conversations with our students, and admit when things, were not, that we didn't handle things the way that we wanted to.
Well, and not only with our students, but the harder sometimes is the one where maybe you have harmed or you were harmed by a colleague. And that can even be a more difficult conversation to navigate. But at the same time, I mean, if we're going to grow together and evolve together and grow as a field, I mean, those are sometimes the conversations that we need to have that really require emotional intelligence and maturity that, and lack of ego and being like, you know, that those are sometimes even more challenging conversations as well. So they both matter.
Totally. And the last thing that comes to me that I think ends us hopefully on a positive note is that the reason that these conversations are so important is because it allows artists to thrive. Right?
Oh, 100%.
That is the whole reason we're having this whole conversation is so
100%.
artists can thrive, that they can be
Yes.
who they are supposed to be in the world. They can then influence those who hear them, right?
Well, and I write this in the chapter that because the body is the instrument, the singing voice can bring you existential pain, but it can also bring you euphoric joy when it lines up and it's great. And that's what we want, right? That thriving experience, whatever that means to the singer. That's
Yeah,
what we want. Correct.
absolutely. Well, time with you brings me euphoric joy.
No,
I'm very,
you as well.
I'm
You as
very
well, my
grateful to
friend.
you, and thank you so much for sharing really deeply on this subject, and
Yeah.
gives me lots of good things to think about.
Me too. Always.
As we've explored in this episode, ethics is something that we need to continue to revisit as teachers. It's just like practice of singing. And I think the more that we can do that, and the more that we can have conversations about what are ethical practices, I think the more we can do right by our students. What comes up for you as we talk about this? Feel free to sound off. You can email me at wholeheartedvoicepedagogy@gmail.com. And as always, you can find me on the socials. My handles on most platforms are at Cisco Songs or at Wholehearted Voice Pedagogy. Sincerely, I would love to hear from you. And as always, I want to thank you for liking, subscribing, and sharing this podcast. More soon. Take care of you.